Welcome everyone. Again, we just give people 1 minute to connect. Then after that, we would introduce the panel chair and hand over to her to continue with the rest of the proceedings. So just give us 1 minute. All right, welcome back from those of you who were here, and welcome to those who are just joining us now. It's exciting to see you back, and we look forward to having an engaged discussion. So before we proceed, I'd like to introduce the chair for this panel. So Monica Forson is a senior advisor of community engagement at the Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission. In this role, she oversees the Commission's engagement with multicultural and multi-faith communities and leads the Reducing Racism project. Prior to this role, she worked at Victoria Police in strategic policy and operational settings to support community engagement outcomes. With experience working across government and community organizations, Monica is a respected leader in the Victorian multicultural community. She advises a range of stakeholders about the importance of diversity and inclusion for culturally and linguistically diverse communities. Monica has been a member of 3 Victorian government advisory groups, including the Victorian African Action Plan Implementation Committee and Victorian Multicultural Commission's Regional Advisory Group. She's also chair of IPAA Victoria African Australian Community of Practice, a member of Culture versus Multicultural Advisory Panel, and a board member of the Footscray Community Arts Center. So that's the profile of our chair. And at this stage, I would hand over the discussion to Monica to take up from here. Thank you.
Thanks so much for the reading of the bio, Michael, and it's lovely to be here. Sorry, Matthew, it's really lovely to be here. I was unfortunately unable to attend the conference last year, so I'm glad to be invited to chair a panel today. So hi everyone, as Matthew said, my name's Monica and I'm really delighted to chair this really exciting panel on narratives with you all. Before I start, I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm meeting you all virtually, unfortunately, on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung of members of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging, and to any Aboriginal people who are part of this session this afternoon. If you're like, this is your second day of the session, so I'm sure that you've met everyone in these virtual rooms and whatnot, but if it's your first time like me, a big welcome to you all. This session is one of many discussing the different impacts of migration and narratives and experiences that African people in our country face. And I've also been part of some other sessions talking about international experiences, but as the name or the title kind of suggests, our discussion over the next hour will be about the importance and resonance of African voices in the community. And we've got some really interesting perspectives covering this topic. So covering research in the music space, storytelling from cultural perspectives and self-advocacy of new migrants to this country. So we have 3 really amazing guest speakers today. And we're really keen to hear from them, and also later on in the session to get your thoughts on their reflections today, and really try to get some interesting conversations happening. So I'll introduce our 3 guests. So the first is Stani Goma, and he's a very well-known and well-loved presenter and producer of Flight 1067 to Africa on PBS FM. I haven't had the chance to meet Stani face to face, but I've heard many amazing things about him and read about him in newspaper articles and whatnot. So that show started nearly 30 years ago now, and it was initially started to help migrants to Australia remain connected to traditional and contemporary African music. Today it's still going strong. with listeners hearing some amazing new music from the continent. And Wani's interviewed amazing people like Monsieur Nador and Angelique Kidjo. And he's also contributed, he's also a contributing author to World Music Global Sounds in Australia and also to Afro Surf. Stani, he'll be today discussing the important topic of music in Australia with the emergence of the African music scene in Australia. And now we're really getting to a point in our country about what does it mean to have an African Australian sound and how do we ensure that it's based on genuine respect to African cultures. So we'll hear from him in a moment. Our next speaker is Amran Abdi, and she is an award-winning Somali-Australian author, writer, and entrepreneur. She's currently completing her master's in arts at Deakin University. She also is working at the Islamic Museum as a program coordinator. Whether she's sharing her perspectives as a young Somalian woman or a role model educator to young people, her enthusiasm, warmth, and love is seen in everything that she does. So today she'll be talking to us about the importance of storytelling and about traditional oral storytelling from a Somali perspective. And then our third speaker who'll be joining us soon is Elsa Lichumba, Dr. Elsa Lichumba, and she's a seasonal lecturer at the University of Newcastle and the founder of Freedom to Belong. Freedom to Belong is a Newcastle-based intercultural training service that equips migrants to foster a sense of belonging in a new country and supports multicultural business teams to rebuild a sense of belonging in the workplace. By the same title, Elsa, she must be a very busy person. She just released a book called Freedom to Belong. In this book, she shares her personal journey about blending cultures in Australia. Overall, she's really committed to bringing awareness within multicultural communities about the importance of cultural transition, about its impact, psychosocial impacts, and the need for that to be properly addressed in our community. So in today's session, Elsa will outline the process of integration of migrants in Australia using her own experiences and talking about the really important self-advocacy role that people play in that experience to successfully integrate. You're probably getting sick of hearing my voice, and I'm almost getting sick of hearing my voice as well. But now we'll be passing over to the speakers. So we'll give them approximately 15 minutes, like in all the other sessions, and then end with Q&A. So I just ask if you could save all your questions until the end, but maybe pop them in the chat if you want to write it down and if you don't want to forget. But hopefully we'll have really long and lengthy discussion at the end of our session. So I'll now pass over to Stani.
Thanks, Monica. Let me just quickly share my screen. Thank you very much. And as Monica mentioned, my name is Stani Goma. I'm the presenter and producer of the weekly African music program called Flight 1067 to Africa on PBS FM every Sunday from 3 till 5 p.m. I want to thank the ASG team for the opportunity to share my perspective on the African music scene in Australia, particularly here in Melbourne. Before I start, let me also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land. I'm talking to you from the Bunurong country, and I would like to pay my respects to the elders, past, present, and future. I would also like to acknowledge that brother that you can see on the right-hand side of the screen there, probably the left-hand side of your screen. His name is Jason Tamura. He's a proud Yorta man on his mother's side, but also an Ethiopian from his father's side. And it's been an important part of an exploration of a conversation between traditional African music and Aboriginal sounds. And I'll come back to that later. In my role as a radio presenter, I've witnessed the evolution of the African music scene in Melbourne. And I've been very privileged to know many of the musicians who play in this space. And it's been fascinating to see how the growth of the music scene has mirrored the evolution of the African community, especially here in Melbourne. And from the 80s, when there was a sort of handful group of African musicians, at the time a very small community, musicians started gigging with Australian musicians because there weren't enough African musicians to form an African-only band. It was the beginning of the development of musical ideas. And it's fair to say that initially, at least, the plan or the aim of those musicians was to reproduce the sound that they remembered, the sound from home. So a South African musician typically will be playing music from South Africa, but surrounded by Australian musicians. Equally, a Congolese musician would be attempting to play Rumba music that he or she grew up listening to, but surrounded by Australian musicians. And what is also fascinating is that from that point, even the Australian musicians that played music with African musicians, some of them went on to create their own sound that is inspired or had elements of African music in it. But over time, of course, as the African community has grown, there's now the possibility of full African bands, but also you have the mixed bands alongside that. And of course, what I mentioned earlier, bands where you see that there's one African musician, but surrounded by predominantly Australian musicians in the band. And all of that is contributing to what, in my view, is a very, very dynamic music scene. And in more recent times, we've had what I was referring to before. What you see there on the screen is the Melbourne African Traditional Ensemble. And these are musicians from all over the African continent. Starting on the left there, you've got Haftu from Ethiopia playing a traditional Ethiopian instrument called the masenko. And next to him is Mbeva from Eritrea, and he's playing a traditional Ethiopian and Eritrean instrument called the kra. And next to Mbeva is Valanga from South Africa, who plays a range of instruments from Southern Africa. And then there's Kofi from West Africa playing the percussion. But what's been very fascinating as part of this journey, I mean, they came together to create a Pan-African ensemble, which I was involved in, but recently joined by Jason Tamiru, playing with them as well and combining his traditional musical language of First Nation Australian with all those sounds coming from various parts of Africa. And that creates a very exciting possibility that is very mutually respectful, but also looking at what can be created that is new, that has never been heard anywhere else but here in Australia. And very much that's the point, that's my contention, my view is that even though initially the music scene came about as a strong desire by members of the African community to remember where they came from, to maintain a very strong connection with their roots, but over time it has taken a different shape. It has really evolved in something that is uniquely African Australian. And there are many examples now of bands that are doing quite well, not just here, but even internationally, because when people listen to that music, they can certainly hear the African influence, but they can also hear the Australian contribution to that music. And a band such as Black Jesus Experience is a very fascinating example of that. And I did hope that I could share the music with you, but I also consider the copyrights issues, so I won't share that with you. But if and when you get the opportunity, do check them out, because what they're doing is using elements of Ethio jazz combined with, elements of Australian music, be it jazz, or hip hop, but also looking at the indigenous themes. And they have a song called "Living on Stolen Land," which is a very interesting concept where the theme is about Aboriginal rights, but the music that goes with it is Ethiopian and mainstream Australian combined and fused together. So that's sort of what I wanted to share with you. I do, as I said, regularly present Flight 1067 to Africa, and the music that I feature on my program is very much about looking at the music from various parts of the continent, but also showcasing the music that happens in the various cities of Australia, including Melbourne, of course. And I think I'll stop there, but give a big plug to Flight 1067 to Africa on PBS FM, and look forward to hearing some questions later on.
Great, thanks so much for that presentation. I've seen that group Black Jesus Experience across Melbourne, and I didn't really understand all the different elements that brought them together. I just looked at it as a very multicultural and diverse band, but it was good to have a bit of understanding about its genesis and the work that they're doing. So thanks for that. If there were any particular questions that people wanted to ask urgently now, go ahead, but if not, I might pass to Amran. Great. We'll go to our next speaker then. But in the chat, you'll see that there are some links to YouTube to watch Black Jesus Experience, but I recommend you save that until after our session and listen into the speakers. So thanks, Amran.
Awesome. Well, thank you for having me. It's an absolute pleasure. I'd like to firstly begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of this land in which we meet on today. I'm in Melbourne, so I believe it's Nam. Yeah, I'd like to pay my respects to the elders, both past, present, and emerging. This is and always will be Aboriginal land. So today, what I sort of wanted to do was, I do have a PowerPoint presentation, but unfortunately, because I am having some technical difficulties, I'll share that with Kennedy for him to share within the group so you guys can have a look at it. But what I wanted to talk about today was the importance of storytelling. Now, storytelling, or the art of telling a story, is something that I'm very, very passionate about. Being a Somali, being an Australian, I also was born in Kenya, so I'm Kenyan national. All those awesome things. And deeply rooted within my culture is storytelling, or oral storytelling. So I'll be going into that. So a little bit about me that hadn't been mentioned. I'm a single mother of two. I also write children's books. I'm an entrepreneur and what I like to call myself as an activist, I guess, in some regard. So what is storytelling? Storytelling is the activity of writing or telling stories. Personally, for me, one of I would have to say, a catalyst in my writing career was when I had met she was from Zimbabwe, a Zimbabwean author who had written children's books. And this was back when I used to live in Perth. Yes, statistically, one of the most isolated cities in the world. And what happened was I attended the Catalyst Youth Summit, and pretty much it was 3 days in the space of time where we discussed issues pertaining to multicultural youth. A fantastic lineup of speakers, fantastic overall event, and we were all sorted out into groups. I remember Taku was talking about, her name's Taku Scrutton, and she was talking about the importance of storytelling and going out there and telling your story. And I remember that particular day, I went home and I was in the car with my friends after the day one of the conference, and I was like, yep, that's it. I'm writing a book. I'm writing a story. And they're like to me, oh, that's so cool, you know? And they were my G-ups, I guess. And what ended up happening was I told them, you know what, I've got this idea. I want to make a book called The Rainbow Hijab, after the rainbow book, the Rainbow Fish, because that was one thing that I loved growing up. The rainbow fish was just one of those classic tales. So fast forward a few years later, I ended up publishing my first children's book, and it's been about 5 years now, and it's received international acclaim. I've received awards for it. I receive all these cool messages and from people who tell me that, you know what, it's the best thing that their children have ever read. It's cool the fact that the children can see themselves in books that they have access to, and all that good stuff. So moving on to storytelling. Oral storytelling, is something that is deeply rooted within the Somali culture. Now, the Somalis are still an oral people. In the Somali context, orality is the preferred medium used for cultural representation. When I was a child, I remember my mother, she used to, excuse me, my nose is a bit runny. When I was a child, my mother would share folklore stories, and each story would have a meaning behind it. For example, these stories would be this one that I remember in particular. It's called Didin iyo Dawaco. Now, Didin iyo Dawaco, Didin is the Somali word for a turtle, and Dawaco is the term for a fox. So pretty much what happens is, you know, in this story, there's a fox and a turtle. Actually can't remember it now, now that I'm put on the spot. But anyways, it's sort of something follows a similar tale of, I guess, an Aesop's fable. For those of you who are familiar with Aesop's fables. So yeah, culturally, we're oral people. We're nomads by culture, so we've got a lot in common with the Aboriginal people, the traditional owners of this land. What other things that we would share are proverbs. Now, proverbs are short sayings that would be shared amongst, you know, by the elders, you know, and my mum would often say this, and my dad too, you know, where they would get angry or upset and I'd be like, oh, kamu now, which pretty much means, you know, either do it well or don't do it at all, you know, and growing up, you know, within a Somali household, that's sort of something that I grew up with. Another thing that we would share, or a part of oral storytelling, is poetry, or shi'r, or gabe. Now, gabe is the Somali word for poetry, and what would happen is generally, like, you would give an aman. Aman is like a, you know, for example, admiring someone or an admiration, or you would also share something woeful. It really depends on the situation at that time. Also, our elders play a huge role in conveying all this information. So generally what would happen is, you know, like your grandmother or your grandfather or the elders of the community will generally share these stories with you. Now moving on to dynamic storytelling. So storytelling is an art form that can be mastered, and it definitely can. So I've got a few tips, about 5 tips as to how you can tell a dynamic story. The first being, tell a story you'd like to hear. So often sometimes you get some stories that are long-winded, you know, don't follow a structure, don't have a beginning, a middle, and an end. That's important. You need to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. So also make sure that another easier way that I've found is tell the story like you talk it, just like a conversation. It flows. So let your story flow in that same way. Another particular way that you could use to tell a dynamic story is use conflict. Pardon me. Use conflict. So, you know, there has to be an antagonist in some regard, whoever that might be, whether it's a person, whatever it could possibly be. It just adds a little bit of spice in the mix. Make it personal and relatable would have to be my third point. So making sure that what you're sharing comes from the heart. And I've noticed that the speeches or the presentations I often give from my heart, are the most relatable. So let it be that. Avoid waffling. That's something I tend to do. I waffle. I digress a lot of the time. but giving yourself that time limit, I guess, following a script if you need to, or PowerPoint presentation, or whatever it might be, is definitely one way to avoid waffling and saying all this useless information, or what others would regard as useless information. And the final being add surprise. So there could be a twist, there could be a turn. I really, really love those find your own adventure or pick your own adventure books, where what happens is, you could either go with A, B, or C, and something cool happens in the end. Yeah, so that concludes my presentation. Yeah, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to take questions.
Thanks so much for your presentation, Amran. It was really interesting. I had no idea that you published a book for children. So I've just been looking on Google and whatnot. It's a beautiful cover, because I could only imagine the illustrations inside the book. I guess out of curiosity, it just popped into my head now, there's storytelling and there's also imagery is quite important for different communities. Was that a consideration in the development of your children's book, the Rainbow Hijab?
Yeah, thank you for the compliment. Yes, I would say that imagery was definitely a huge part of the actual book itself. So originally, I'll actually share the images that I originally had made, and I went onto this site called Fiverr.com. I'm not too sure if people are aware of it. So pretty much what happens is you post an ad, and for $5, somebody around the world will do a job for you, whether it's design or web or whatever it may be. And I received all the images and I did not like them. They were 2D, they were just not what I wanted. And I told myself that I wanted to have the best. Like, if my hijab means the world to me, and I need to make sure that I'm representing it in a good way. And so I used to work in an Anglican school back in Perth, and one of the art teachers was actually the illustrator that created the book. So we went back, I told her about my idea. She was even more excited than I was. She decided to go full watercolor paint. She went full watercolor paint, and it was really cool because she's a mother as well. And I had my son at that time, and we would have play dates, and our kids will sort of play in the background while we're working alongside each other. And yeah, it was pretty cool. So yeah, I would say, to answer your question, imagery is huge, especially in children's books. You need to get the right color, you need to get the right shape, you've got to get the right character. I don't know if you guys have noticed, but the when you guys do look at the Rainbow Hijab, the illustrator actually based the character Amira on me, so we do look alike.
I think that sort of representation is important for young African kids to pick up a book, be it a children's book like that, and see themselves represented in it, and for you, a literal representation of yourself.
Absolutely.
Did you have anything else to add? Sorry, I cut you off.
Yeah, sorry. That's totally fine. So growing up as a young African, I would say that I was bullied a lot. I went to the most bogan school ever. And I was one of 3 African kids in the entire school, and one of them was my brother. So there were barely any of us. And so what happened was, it was tough. I'd have things thrown at me. People would call me names. I'd have to sit awkward. And then I had the added bonus of being a Muslim woman. So I'd have all these awkward conversations with teachers. And I randomly had some teacher that yelled out, "Oh, I want to become Muslim so I can marry 4 wives." And everyone's like, "What, sir?" And he's like, "Yeah, ask Amran." And it put me in an awkward position. So when you have situations like that, you learn to deal with it one of 2 ways. I learned to deal with it with humor. That's one thing that I do. It's bad because I tend to joke about things that aren't very funny sometimes, but it's one coping mechanism that I learned. And I had this English teacher towards the end of my schooling, and she was probably a huge catalyst for me in my writing journey. So she gave us a journal, and in this journal, she taught us to write essay drafts and things of that sort in this book. And me being the nerd that I was, I went over and beyond, and I wrote rebuttals, from newspaper articles and all that good stuff. And yeah, and so that probably helped in catalyzing, as a catalyst to speed track my writing career.
Great, thank you. I feel like I've got a bunch of other questions for you, but we'll save them for the Q&A session. But thanks for your presentation.
No worries, my absolute pleasure.
And now we have our third speaker, Dr. Elsa Lichumba. So if she's able to turn on her video, and yes, we welcome you.
Yes, hello, hi everyone. Okay, I think I'm going to share my screen, if that is possible.
Can you see the share screen function?
Yes, I can. Okay, it's working. Okay, good. I've got just 13 slides, so bear with me. It's not going to be too long. Okay, so the theme of the conference focus attention on solidarity in diversity. So I decided to take one of the questions, which is in the identity conflict that I would say Amran just explained, who then has the power to integrate or foster belonging of the migrant when we are in that scene of identity conflict? So that's the question that I decided to take on. So why is that? Because belonging, the concept of belonging, a good sense of belonging matters at national and individual level. And national level, I would say the United Nations has one of their sustainable development goals, and they say that they have this motto to leave no one behind. So it's a clear call that the sustainable development should be inclusive, including migrants, migrant groups. At individual level, it's good for psychological safety as well. To have a good sense of belonging affects everywhere, productivity, all different spheres of life. So what is the problem then? The issue is that we hear a lot that integration is a two-way thing, and a two-way road, where both sides, both players, they are part of the game, I'll put it this way. So to me, the issue is that when migrants do face identity conflict while they are in a new space, the locals at times, they fail to do their job because technically it's supposed to do it to be a two-way. So there is an expectation that you would assimilate as opposed to integrate / belong. So I will reflect briefly on my experience about being able to redefine sense of belonging in the new land. And I argue that in the absence of that collaboration that I'm talking about in the identity conflict, the migrant ends up becoming their own savior, which activates a superpower, a powerful agent of change for themselves by finding alternatives to redefine their sense of belonging. This is the structure of my argumentation. I'll start with my personal account, my identity challenges, and the realization of disrupted support, my strategies, and finally, I'll close with suggestions. So I came here as an international student in 2008 from Mozambique, new country, new space, new environment, new protocol, everything different. So I experienced culture shock, consequently lost my sense of belonging. And how did people react to that? I would say the locals, they made it even worse by throwing in another layer of discrimination to my already big process of doing cultural transition. Consequently, I chose separation while I'm here. Separation from society. You just distance yourself. Felt homesick all the time, did not understand what really was happening to me at first, felt uncomfortable and rejected, very strong emotions there. No support. And the other side, it was more of you must adjust at any costs. So my evaluation of this experience, I would say it wasn't a good experience. But at the same time, I have to admit that I assumed that life would just be the same being in a new country. So I did not make any effort to connect some stage with locals. Chose to be my own migrant circle of friends, most of the time, which not good ideas, it did not help me to achieve what I was wanting to, which is a sense of belonging. And the locals constantly, they remind you, excuse me, you're an outsider by simple questions of where you're from or your accent, or, you know, they remind you. So I remained in the same place of lost sense of belonging. So if I could ask myself, what could have helped me during the transition, I would say I was completely unaware that each time you move to a new country, new space, you go through stages, 4 key stages. The honeymoon, the excitement of welcome, new country, new home. We go from the honeymoon down into the shock. It's a new place, new culture, new environment. Everything is new, even new race, to be honest, everything is different. So it goes down to the shock. And this is where the cultural identity conflict takes place. And it took place for me. This is exactly where things went really down. And this is why I ask, in the identity conflict, who does the work? Taking into account that it should be a two-way thing, who actually ends up doing the work. So it could have also helped if I knew all these theoretical frameworks that analyze, you know, how people adjust to new places, separation, integration, marginalization, assimilation. These are options that people can choose from when deciding what to do, being in a new place. Now, what skills could have helped me during that that season? Again, I think it would have been important, I mean, key for me, extremely significant if I was aware of these stages. Just to start with, just to know that you're going to a new country, there's something called cultural transition. It unfolds in 4 ways, and this is how they look like. Why do I say would be better if I had that? Because this could help me navigate life in the new land. And I mean, dealing with personal identity conflict. Knowing this, to me, makes all the difference. It's like a game changer. So, and then they also help you deal with racism, for instance, and discrimination. You know, because you know, in a different place, and not that you see then that has a right thing to do, but you kind of frame your response in a much better way. So what happened in the identity conflict? So I had to become my own savior. So if you want to know who does the job in the end, it's the migrant. In the very end, in the identity conflict, it's not a two-way thing. It could be a two-way in the papers, but in the actual stage, it becomes the migrant needs to pull back and redefine by themselves what they want to be in the new place. Now back to my question. I'm about to close. Who has the power to redefine? It's still the migrant. And I had to do that for myself. I am no longer waiting to be accepted by my host society. I love the place, but I decided I am going to be the change that I want to see. I'm going to make things around, change things around. And one of the things that I discovered in the process of a lot of reading and introspection, I discovered this, that belonging is actually a mindset. It's nothing to do with place. My sense of identity, it's built within myself, and I can carry that wherever, regardless. And I'm not saying that the locals will change, but your attitude to towards what is done changes completely. So what do I plan to do in the future? Number one, I still believe that, yes, it's important to involve the two sides. Some education on that would help. And teaching about cultural differences and race equity and so forth. The second step would be work with migrants to teach how to deal with personal identity conflict. and service providers to remove those obstacles in accessing those services that I believe that could make a huge difference, just knowing basic things such as this one here. And I guess that's the end of my contribution to this theme of that solidarity and diversity. In the end, the migrant becomes their own savior. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Elsa, for that really interesting and thought-provoking presentation. It was really interesting to hear the different experiences that you had through your journey here and the reflections on what better support could be provided for new migrants to this country. We've finished very quickly. I'd made an assumption that we'd be going over time. I'd have to corral you all to finish your presentations and stick to your speaking notes, but we've gone really quickly through this. So we're now able to open this session up to attendees to ask questions to the panelists. So if you did have any questions that you were holding on to, I'd really encourage you to put your hand up and ask away. I think that whilst we're waiting for questions to come in, I might ask my question, and it's really reflecting of some of the things that you spoke about, Elsa, and the migrant experience and about cultural identity. What do you see are the commonality and experiences of African people, either born here or who have arrived here very early, as children, and their experiences and understanding culture and really connecting and integrating into society in Australia?
So was that for me?
Yes.
Sorry, because of the context of children, I thought, oh, it must be Amran, but then because she's the kids, right? But it's all right. I'll come to that.
Yeah,
that's a very good question, because since I've discovered this, I would say that's why I call my book Freedom to Belong. There's freedom in that. I don't have to be confined by, belonging, just assigned, to one specific geographic location. And at the same time, I don't allow anyone to box me as to where do I belong. So since I discovered that, I'm moving towards another stage now, which is I finished, I'm halfway, I wouldn't say finished, not halfway, it's not finished. 90% done with my children's book. So that's why I've asked Amran's email, because what I'm doing next, I'm trying to bring the same conversation within children of migrant parents. So I want to begin the conversation with kids and begin to find ways to say, look, this may not be the popular thing, but this is what I believe, that belonging is not about the place. Yes, the kids can know how things are done at home, my kids know the language, the food, everything culturally, like mom and dad, they do, But I don't think parents should give the children the freedom to decide their cultural identity. Does it make sense? I know it's not popular. The more we learn and stick to what we know, because look, this is an open world. This is the consequence of migration. We've left home. There's no going back home. And if we don't give the freedom for the kids to make that decision, they're gonna be in a mental state of longing for a home that no longer fits in the mind. So what I'm doing, I'm having a little bit of challenge as to how do I make these kids book in a way that doesn't confront, doesn't create conflict in the family. Because I want to encourage the kids, to not to go wild though, but, to reframe and adjust. But at the same time, I know that mom and dad, sometimes they can impose the identity, you know, you belong to this identity, and that's not reality. The world has changed. We're in a different place. We're finding ourselves everywhere. How can we just confine our identity to this point, this place alone? I mean, one place alone. If that answers your question, Monica.
Yeah, that was a really interesting reflection. And I think that your point about parents should giving children the freedom to decide their identities really spoke to me. I think can sometimes be stuck in Africa of the 1980s before they came to Australia. Expect their children to live in that way. Before moving to Stani, I'd be really keen, Amran, I can pick up on your accent. You probably lived in Australia, if not you're born here, but been here a really long time. What are your thoughts on those comments just then about being able to create your own identity?
Sure, I was just going to ask to interject. I have lived experiences of everything that Dr. Elsa is talking about. So I'm like a bit about my cultural background. I was 6 months old when I moved from Kenya and we were accepted as refugees to New Zealand. And then from New Zealand to Perth to Melbourne. So that's pretty much me and my cultural background. And my parents are Somali. And I identify as Somali. That explains my weird accent. People are like, "Are you from England?" I'm like, "No, it's Kiwi plus the Aussie." You know, it makes that kind of an accent. But I digress. My point is that I really agree with the point that Dr. Elsa said about parents allowing their children to be able to discover their cultural identity. Growing up, for me personally, I struggled with identity my whole entire life. Like, am I Somali? Am I Kenyan? Am I Kiwi? Am I Aussie? And like people would ask me, "Are you Aussie? Do you consider yourself being an Aussie?" And I'm like, "No, I just live in Australia." Like, you know, and like it was the same when I went to Kenya, and people would be like, "Oh, welcome, you know, where are you from?" And I'd be like, "I'm Kenyan," you know, and they'd be like, "No, you're not Kenyan, you know, where are you from?" And I'd be like, "Australia." And they'd be like, "Ah, that's where you're from. That's where you're really from." So it's just like that. Like growing up in Australia as well, you've got all these cultures and that are a part of you. So much intersectionality within intersectionality. And I guess one thing that I had to learn to do early on, and my parents did a brilliant job of it. So it's an Abdi tradition that in primary school, we went to a Muslim school. And in high school, 10, 11, and 12, we completed our studies in a private public school. And why my parents did that was they were like, you have to learn to live in the real world. Like the Islamic school, yes, you built your basis, you know who you are, you know, but you need to learn what life really is on the other side, on the flip side. And I really commend my parents for that, because it was an eye opener. When you're dealing with people of many different walks of life, you know, when you've got, you know, bisexuals and you know, people from the LGBTQI community and all that stuff, you know, people, when you learn to integrate with all those different types of people, you open your eyes a lot, and you learn different perspectives. And so one thing that I learned to do besides dealing with it with humor was also learning and understanding the fact that the concept of home is fluid, just like this cup of water. You know, at the end of the day, wherever you feel home or wherever you feel most comfortable, that's home for you. And for me, I think I came to the conclusion after many, many, many years of doing soul searching, was that the concept of home, yes, it is fluid. And number two, that it's where my loved ones are. It's where I feel most comfortable, and no one can take that away from me. Another thing that I learned to do was, so for example, Eid was yesterday. Unfortunately, we didn't get to celebrate it. Thanks, Daniel Andrews. But what ended up happening was, traditionally what we do is we would gather, have a traditional Aussie barbecue on Eid, a Muslim celebration. We'd also have traditional mandazi, which is the flatbread of Kenya. And, you know, we'd have Somali shah, and and maybe we might even play a game of rugby or soccer, depending on what we're feeling.
True.
Yes.
And that's a good one. I'm just 1 minute before you pass it on. So to me, why can't we have two homes? Anyway, I'll pass. Don't want to take up the words.
Yes, Stani, I was really keen to hear your thoughts on this topic about balancing identity and kind of picking and choosing the best parts of your culture.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question. I mean, who can argue against giving children choice? Ultimately, that is, to me, that's the that's a very desirable and I think very important position to take. I guess I come from the perspective of ensuring that how can people have a choice if they haven't got the knowledge? How can they value something if they don't know it? And so my position is that we need to do what we can to provide as much exposure or understanding or knowledge so that they can make an informed decision. So what I do through my radio program is very much about sharing, because culture is not just a set of beliefs. It's actually, it's food, it's language, it's a range of things. And in my case, music is an important part of that. And so my view is that, particularly for people like myself, I wasn't born here, I didn't grow up here. And so I came to this country as a fully formed individual. And so my contribution to my community and to the country is to share what I know, not as a way of forcing anybody to consume it or to take it, but to put it out there so they know. And so that when somebody listens to a piece of music, whether it's come from South Africa, from Congo, my country of birth, or Ghana, or whatever the case is, if they choose not to, if they think it, that's fine. But if they don't know it, if they never heard it, how can they possibly choose well if they haven't heard? So that's kind of where I'm coming from. The other thing that I also find very challenging is, and this is going back to the point that was made earlier, of that forced choice. Why are people being forced to actually choose this or the other when things can be so fluid? And it seems to me that ultimately, let them experience everything and anything at any time, and then over time, as I'm finding more and more as I speak to particularly those who were born here or grew up here, is that I've seen a few examples when people who've gone to Africa, they think, I wish I knew this long time ago. And it seems to me that not knowing is the biggest challenge that we have. And so it seems to me that we should do everything that we can to teach the next generation or give them access to that information, that knowledge, so that they can make informed decisions. Anyway, I've gone into probably a bit too long, but that's my perspective.
No, that's really interesting. I was hoping to pick up on that from like a musical lens as well. Like you spoke about the merging of like African culture and African music with Australian, and then there is an intergenerational divide, I think, and what is an African Australian sound. So do you have any thoughts on the difference between people that have migrated to Australia and what they bring in the musical scene versus kids here and their influence with this like Pan-African style of music, or maybe just a fancy way to talk about like grime and other influences and like hip hop in creating a uniquely African Australian sound, and how that links with identity?
Again, a very, very good question. And going back to my personal experience. So I grew up listening to African music. I heard music from elsewhere, heard reggae, heard like is the case in all parts of the world, heard a lot of American music. But for maybe because I'm a Congolese, I always loved my Congolese music. So therefore, when I came here, I missed it. And so the first thing I did is to try and find ways to make sure that I had access to that here. But that doesn't mean that's all I listen to. I listen to a range of other music as well. And it seems to me that if I didn't have access to that, I would have been a much less happy person living in this country. So having had access to that was good, but I could then build on top of that and explore other options. but I'm also very aware that for those who are born here, African music is not what I call the heartbeat. That's not, to me, that's my heartbeat because that's what I grew up with. But for someone born here, that wouldn't be the case. They have been in a completely separate environment, and therefore their desire and their connection to music is very different. Having said that, though, it's the same thing potentially with food. If they grew up in a household where the parents were listening to a particular style of music, then they are exposed to that music. And if they choose to not really adopt it and make it part of their own, that's fine, but at least they know it. They do know it. And it seems to me that the quality that exists in that music needs to be understood, because let's not forget that part of the challenge that we have is that we live, particularly in the West, we live in a context where other cultures are painted in a very negative light. And so we're not even just talking about people not freely choosing not to have that music, but we're talking about a case where somebody might actually choose not to have anything to do with that culture because they perceive it as being bad. They perceive it as being not being as good in terms of quality and value as something else. And therefore, the conversation needs to be deeper. The next generation needs to understand the value of that culture so that even if they choose not to engage with it, it's not because they perceived it as being bad, or even worse, they perceive it as being engaging with that culture would diminish them, will be in the eyes of the host country, will make them a lesser Australian or not as cool, not as happening. So that to me, they're the things that we need to be very mindful of, that we don't want to contribute to a situation where either intentionally or unintentionally, we're not allowing people to choose not to engage with it, because not so much because they don't want to, but because it's been ingrained in them that it's not a desirable thing to have. So that's kind of my angle.
Yeah, thanks for that. As a youth worker, I worked with young people who would readily play their hip hop music, and then when they got to their traditional music, they'd skip over it really quickly in thoughts that it might be embarrassing or whatnot. But I have seen a change over the last few years, particularly with this worldwide kind of phenomenon, with Afrobeat music and whatnot, and seeing more people normalize it. They want to be part of it, and it's really, I'd say, made a lot of young people quite proud of that sort of music. And now you've start to see that seeping into other cultural elements like food challenges and whatnot, where it's almost cool to be African, and blending of that hip hop and Black culture with this more traditional sort of elements of who we are. So yeah, at least from a personal perspective, I think it's a lot easier to be authentically African Australian, or however you identify.
Absolutely. So to me, the challenge is, how do we make being African cool? Now, if somebody chooses not to be cool, to be African because they just want to be something else, that's fine. But if they're choosing not to be African because they think it's not cool, or because they think it might be embarrassing, then I think we have a problem. And to me, that is not a free choice. That is actually a choice that is influenced by a context that devalue a certain aspect that is available to them through their parents, that they're refusing to engage with because in their mind, it diminishes them as an individual.
Did either of the other panelists want to jump in at all?
Yep, could I quickly jump in?
Yes.
Sorry, Elsa, was that you? No. Okay.
Yeah, I'll wait.
Okay. So yeah, I think your point, Stang, sorry, I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, about African music being something very popular and how to make Africanism, if you may, really cool. I think within the Somali community is something that I've noticed is that recently in the diaspora, a lot of young Somalis are, you know, are getting a little bit more connected to the arts, music in particular, where we've seen a lot of artists, you know, that have been producing a lot of music. Have, you know, there's sort of been a renaissance, if you will, of all these artists and all their forms of art and music. So I think it's definitely being a thing, and people are all more about, you know, you hear terms like Pan-Africanism and, you know, people wanting to go back to home to Africa and rebuild Africa. You've got Akon who went back home, you know, and rebuilt, you know, parts of Africa. And so I think that wave is definitely catching on within Gen Y. I'm a Gen Y, and Gen Z definitely I've seen with my siblings as well. It's definitely catching on, even with things as simple as food, like Ethiopian injera and shidni and all that good stuff. You know, it's becoming a thing, you know, and fufu and ugali and sukuma, all that sorts of stuff. People are actually now paying more attention to it. And because we live in such a beautiful city like Melbourne, we have access to all of that. So I think the wave is definitely catching on, and people are also, you know, picking up on all these things. And I think Africanism is starting to become a really cool thing, whether it's the culture, whether it's the language, whether it's the food, the music. I love Maitri Gims, by the way, as a Congolese guy. I really like his music. But yeah, I would have to say, I think also one thing that I've noticed is after Black Panther came out, there was a huge, you know, people hopped on the bandwagon and were like, oh yeah, Wakanda and all that good stuff. And I think that's probably where everybody was bitten by the no, that's a terrible term. I was going to say African bug, but we don't want to associate Africa and bugs. But yeah, I think that's definitely one thing that I've noticed as a young Somali woman living in the diaspora.
And Dr. Elsa, did you have anything else to add to that?
Probably just a little bit, because she covered some of the points that I wanted to also add to the discussion. But I think also this integration or decision to redefine for yourself, not waiting for any savior, because if we're waiting for the outside to change, it will not, you know, it will not change. So in the identity conflict, you have to make a decision to stand for yourself. And in my experience, when I've made a decision to do that, I've learned a lot. And that doesn't make me less African than, say, you know, most of us in the group. But I think that this is the reason why, after doing the book, I'm still following up with this, because I think that you can have both, but you don't have to give up your identity, the foods you eat. You don't have to. So if we continue to confine belonging to place, you know, to a sign, to a mark, I don't think we're not going to go ahead. It's like we're waiting for a savior, and we can be our own saviors. You know, this is the approach that I want to. Yes, there's bad things, there's racism. I've experienced that. My son has experienced that. I had to write a 3 pages long letter to the State Department of Education. But at the end of the day, I got to teach him to be his own savior and not wait for people to agree with what he likes, with what he eats, with his skin color, with his, you know, it's not going to happen. So I guess the key for me was when I was able to redefine the concept for myself and not take someone else's definition, because they say, where are you from? Your accent, you know, they're already kicking you out. It's not a good word. They have a box where they can decide and classify whether you fit. I'm no longer waiting for anyone else's, you know, criteria to decide where I belong. I think there's a powerful quote that I even have in the book. This: "You're only free when you realize you belong nowhere," by Maya Angelou, if you can read. She says, you're only free when you realize you belong nowhere. The price is high. The cost is high, because you've got to sacrifice a few things there. It's not a cheap or free ride, this process, but the reward is great.
Thank you. And from the chat, I can see that Kennedy has a question. So did you want to put your video on and audio and ask away?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Chair. been following this very interesting conversation, this panel. And what is really fascinating is how the panelists are woven in their life experiences to the themes and the topics that they're speaking about. And one of the really striking things that I've picked out is the relationship between identity, as you define it yourself, and narratives, what the others define, try to define you, and sort of trying to navigate the tensions between the two. And perhaps the panelists can reflect on what I could pick on was each of you has been on a journey of trying to navigate the two, but have you gotten to a point where you found a balance between number one, having sort of identified like this is who I am, like settle on your identity, but also found a way of dealing with narratives, or is this still a process that is changing for you?
I think, oh, sorry.
Why don't you go first and then everyone?
Yeah. So that's a good, thanks for that question, Kennedy. The reason why I wrote the book is because I had an epiphany. And I got to a point where I discovered that, belonging is actually not about a place. I actually can redefine my concept of belonging. It's not about a place, it's a mindset. I can come with confidence say I've achieved that. But now moving forward, do I still face challenges every day? Of course, everywhere. I had a few 2 weeks ago in the workplace. I can see it's pure discrimination, but do I still dwell on that? Do I still resent that? Not anymore. So you see, it's not that you all of the sudden there's no more problems. There's no one coming to challenge your settled identity, you know. It still keeps different ways, different forms. But I guess when you have made a decision, you know where you stand. You can even pinpoint that, well, this is another one. I'm just gonna let it one go. Because if I dwell too much on this, I'm not gonna go anywhere.
Thank you. Stani or Amran, who wants to go next? Stani.
Yeah, I'm happy to go next. Yeah, gee, I mean, that's again another great question, a tough one. But for me, I see myself, and this is the identity question. I see myself as an African person born in the Congo and now living in Australia. So I engage with the world in those terms. So I have no question mark around my identity that is very clearly defined in my mind. And I'm also aware that I'm in a world that sometimes I walk into a room, I haven't said anything, I haven't done anything, but there is a negative vibe from somebody. I can't control that. There's nothing I can do about it, and that's not my problem. And so with my identity, I give, I put out positive energy, and sometimes I get some positive energy back, sometimes I get negative energy. That's fine. So I don't really have any other concern in relation to that, except to be confident in myself as an African person, born in Africa, I grew up in Africa. I'm also, and again, this is not part of the discussion, I very often reflect on the history of our continent. And I very strongly embrace the Pan-African identity. I am an African, and I see the entire continent of Africa as my home. I also feel I do have the right to be in this country as an Australian citizen, and I don't undervalue that. I don't overstate it or understate it. I've got rights and responsibilities, but I engage with the world as an African person living in Australia. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. And Amran? What's your thoughts on that question about who are you and your place and identity?
Sure. Firstly, sorry if you guys can hear my daughter in the background. She just woke up from her nap. But I'd have to say identity for me is a fluid concept, just like home. I can't say that I have reached a point, or I don't think I will ever reach a point where I'll be like, okay, right, this is who I am. Yes, there are some aspects of me that I like Stan had said previously. For example, the fact that I'm African, the fact that I'm Somali, the fact that I am, Kenyan, the fact that I'm Muslim, the fact that I'm a woman, all of those sorts of stuff. If that's what you define as identity, yes, I feel stagnant. I feel 100% defined in that regard. When it comes to everything else, for example, like identity in terms of being a single mother, in terms of being someone that suffers from mental illness, in terms of being all these different things, I would say that it's always going to flow, and I'm never going to stay stagnant in that regard. So it really depends what your definition of identity is, I guess, and I guess what it really means to you as an individual.
Thank you. So yeah, we've kind of covered the full spectrum of thoughts really about being creating your own identity and using your own language and experiences to cover that, to then how it differs from when you are born on the continent and the level of assurity I think it gives you in who you are, and then navigating yourselves through an Australian or a white sort of lens, and then really the intersectionality, all the different pieces that make a person and that forming who you are. And I guess on a personal note for me, being biracial, and the added layer of how you see yourself internally versus how you're perceived in the external, and kind of piecing together who you are is another really interesting thing to explore. I did have a question, I think, from Hanad about identity. I'm not sure if he's still here and he wants to ask that question. Oh, he is here. Did you want to ask your question to the panel?
Hey, Monica. No, it wasn't. Yeah, it wasn't really a question. Just really liked the conversation around having access. I couldn't agree more. But I think having the willingness to explore. I'm born and raised in Melbourne. I do identify as African or East African Somali. So it's living in public housing and living in very small communities. It can be very, we can get used to or comfortable with our own community, and we don't want to branch out and learn about new communities or other cultures in Australia. And I think it really hit home what you said, Amran, is going from a private Muslim school to a public school. I had the same experience, and it was a life-changing experience for me. Being going to an Islamic school, Islamic friends. There's a lot of African people, African students used to go to that school. Then going to a public school, it's, I gotta start from scratch. My communication, how I engage with other people, how do I make conversation? It's anxiety. So it's me taking that next step, right? And a lot of the stuff that you said around discrimination and being isolated and being excluded, those are real things, And it's quite interesting. If I can share one thing, Monica, it's when my family first came to Australia, when we first moved to Werribee, it's I played for a football team, football team. I was the only person of color in the team. So my mum would take me to the game every single Sunday, and then she'd see all the other mothers bring oranges and water bottles and things for their kids. So one day, my mum brought a whole pot of rice and chicken and meat at the game. And mind you, she didn't know because she didn't know that, people meant to have oranges and water, and she just put it down. She said, "Oh, everyone eat." So people found it, humorous, and people started laughing, but people started joining in, started eating the food, after the game. So it's taking risks, exploring, putting yourself out there, because, I like what you said, Elsa, it's two ways, it's, yeah, we're new to the country, but also we've got to take that step and really get to understand our neighbors and people around us too. So really like this conversation. Thank you.
I think, Hannah, just reflecting on that quickly, you said it's kind of funny now when you're sharing it with us, but as a child, how did that make you feel? Did it make you feel kind of othered? Like your mom clearly like missing the memo of like the oranges, or were you quite proud of her in that sense, reflecting back on what it would have been like as a child?
It was interesting. It was embarrassing at a little bit, I'm thinking, well, Mom, what are you doing? Like, why are you bringing the rice and the chicken and everything, right? But I could see like she cares, like she wants to get to know the other parents and she wants to make conversation and she's trying, right? And I think me being a father now, and I'm also Gen Y. I am Gen Y, right? Me being a father, like I'm gonna, do the same things where like when my daughter and my kids, I'm gonna make sure, they get to know other cultures and other, other diversities or other minorities and put themselves out there, because a lot of the times we can get very comfortable in our own little silos, and it makes it very harder for us as citizens. So yeah, I think it's the responsibility now falls on our generation to push that forward, really push the boundaries. So yeah, thank you.
I love
Can I
that
just quickly
point.
add to that? Sorry.
Yes, both you and Elsa. Who wants to go?
That's all right. I'll go first, Amran.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I like what you said, Hanad, when you said staying in our own silos, and that's a problem. Looking back, if I would create a blueprint for any migrant to have an amazing experience, like arriving into a new place, we say, do this, do that, don't do that. That would be one of the things I would say, don't do that. Enlarge your borders. Try avoid just staying in your own, So that's a very good point that I should highlight. Just breaking away of your own.
Do you think
cycle
different, Elsa, coming from a smaller group that migrated? Like the Mozambique community is quite small in Australia compared to the Somali community. Do you think it just depends on your community, that idea of not wanting to be so insular? It almost feels like you have to be just based on the small community that the Mozambique community has here.
I wouldn't say depending, it has to do with the size of the community. I think the challenge is even more, the comfort is towards those who have larger groups. They can just sit and say, oh, nothing has changed. I'm just surrounded by my people. Everything is the same. Nothing has changed. And I guess that's the challenge, because they have this massive group. So I would still say we shouldn't have to say, I'm not going out of my little square because my community group is bigger than yours, you know what I mean? I think regardless of the size, if we really, really mean to make change, we should, every now and then, doesn't have to be like you forget where you're coming from. No. Every now and then, going out, getting to know the place where I am, taking risks, as Hanad explained.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I cut you off, sorry.
No, that's all good. So the point that I was going to make, actually I have a little bit of an anecdote to share that similar to Hanad's. Hi, Hanad, by the way. Anyways, what happened was when I was in primary school, I think I was in year 4, excuse me, the runny nose again. What ended up happening was, so we'd have like a class party at the end of term, every year, every term. And my mom was adamant about making something. She was like, yep, you are not going to have you're not going to have chips or store-bought goods. So she's like, I'm going to make something for you. I got excited. She made my favorite. I love mandazi. She made the mandazi, and she also made kashato. It was like a saffron colored kashato. Very, very nice. Kashato is like a Somali sweet. And she made that early morning, and she packed it all up, and I was so excited, I was chuffed, I'm like, yeah, I'm going to take this to my class. I took it to my class and we had our party. And then I end up seeing these 2 girls laughing, and they open up the mandazi and they start smelling it. They're like, ew, look at this. This is disgusting. And like, I couldn't hold back my tears. I start bawling my eyes out. And I quickly asked the teacher if I could run to the bathroom. And so when I come back, I see them doing the same thing. And they're like, oh my gosh, yeah, this is so disgusting. Oh my gosh, it should have something in here. And what sort of shocked me was the fact that both these girls were colored themselves. One was Kurdish and the other one was and the other one was South African. And I just thought, wow, you guys are going to be cultured and start picking on me for bringing my cultural food. So anyways, that was the point that I wanted to sort of make. In regards to assimilation, which I call the A word, I think it's such a negative word to use. This one time I remember there was this German guy. He ended up coming over to my mom and dad's shop back in Perth, and he was like, you look what you're wearing, all this stuff, He's like, go wear it in your house. Go pray in your house. Don't do it outside. And I said, well, this is a part of me. This is a part of my faith. I will do as I please. You know, you can't tell me what to do. And he's like, this is the problem. You bring your culture outside, you bring your religion outside, and you don't assimilate. And I said, well, we don't have to assimilate with society. We have to integrate with society. So I do.
You just muted yourself.
Sorry, I was getting a phone call. We need in as community and share our our perspectives as multicultural communities, and step out at the same regard and learn from the non-colored whiter communities.
Thank you. And we really only have time for one last question. And I kind of wanted to wrap it up being more future focused, but picking up on Stani's point earlier about narratives and how largely there's been quite a negative narrative and perceptions in African people in our country, but particularly in the state of Victoria. So I guess in a perfect world, I'm looking forward, what would you want the narrative to be when we do think of African Australians in this country? So what words would you use? What's our legacy really? That really can be from whatever perspective you choose, be it from a musical, arts perspective, cultural. Yeah, I won't prompt anymore, but who would like to answer that question first? What would you like the African Australian narrative to be moving forward?
I could start.
Yeah, you can start. Yeah.
I'd say, okay, I'll use the analogy of a faucet. That we want to, that young Africans or Africans in general, we're like faucets. We like to give, we like to give in abundance. We like to nourish. We like, all those sorts of things. So I would say, I'd love for people to know that we're giving people, we're generous people. We're not pirates, Somali pirates, or we're not, African gangs and all that good stuff. Good stuff, I say. So that's probably one thing that I'd want everybody to know.
Stani?
Yeah, thank you. Well, my perspective is that we have always made a significant contribution, in the culture, in sports. It's huge. I mean, we are a very tiny proportion of the population. You look at sort of AFL team, you see the representation of Africans and right across the board. And so it seems to me that we need to get to a position where the wider society acknowledges, celebrates, and welcome, ideally, African contribution rather than seeing us as a problem, obviously, because that's kind of been the narrative. We are not a problem. And I think one of the things that concerns me is that we're not to internalize that. We're not to start viewing ourselves as a problem because someone else says we are a problem. And so that to me is but in the music field, it's happening. There's a young woman called Sampa the Great. Fabulous. She's already, she's up there with the best of them. And so I'm very confident that, there's no turning back. So I'm very, very positive about the, particularly in the music space, the contribution of the African community here is set to really explode.
Thank you. And finally to you, Elsa, what are your thoughts?
Well, aligning to your question, you asked what would be, how do you want us to be seen in Australia as of African descent? Well, I would say I would like us to be seen as citizens of the universe that belong wherever they want to, that we have freedom to belong anywhere. Because we are really good. We're good people. We are free to belong anywhere. So that's how I would like to change the narrative, that we have freedom to belong anywhere we want.
You don't have to sell it to any of us in this chat. An easy pitch.
I know, right? And which is the title of my book which is, by the way, you talked about selling. Yeah. Which is available on Amazon if anyone wants to. I'm sorry, but I just did it. I don't know how I'm supposed to do it.
Can you put a link in the chat? Find it. That'd be really great.
Are we shamelessly plugging ourselves in? I just wanted to say something. Sure.
Church announcements, go ahead.
I also run an NGO, and it's called Gabernol, which means the lively, active women in Somali. I don't use the word nag because it's very offensive. But pretty much what I do is I help and I assist African women between the ages of 15 and 35. We teach them financial literacy. So if that sounds like you, or you'd be interested in probably being a mentor or giving a presentation, please hit me up.
Thank you. And Stani, do you have anything to promote?
Simon's already done it for me. Simon on there. Thank you, Simon has written something there. Obviously, he listens to the show, and all I can say is, yeah, get on flight 1067 to Africa on Sunday. If you haven't heard it yet, it's an interesting journey, and it's very much about what we've been talking about all afternoon. It's just putting it out there for people to access it. It doesn't matter whether you're African or non-African. It's music, and music is about bringing people together, and so the journey is about just getting on board and experiencing the positivity that comes from Africa. That's it.
And Simon, did you want to say anything?
Oh yeah, hi. Yeah, I profound points is, being who I am, I have a lot of trouble teaching the class that I do. And so I introduce students to music, culture, the arts, and also the history of decolonization, colonization, and all that stuff at Melbourne Uni. And I'm pretty much the only one that does. I think there's one other class at the entire university, which focuses more on arts and culture. And it's a shame. And when I retire, I'd like an African to take over, but there's zero prospect in the current financial climate of that happening. And Priya's also taught on the class a little bit too. And we've had Berhan from Africa Think Tank. And, we have an obligation, really.
Thanks, Simon. Well, we've only got 2 minutes left, and maybe that means you've got 2 extra minutes to get yourself a cup of coffee or tea, or quickly rush to the toilet before the final session for this afternoon. But I'd just like to thank all the speakers and the panelists today. It's been really interesting, and I've learned a lot. And thanks for letting me kind of guide you through this session today. So I might pass back to Matthew now. It's a little bit hard to hear you, Matthew. Maybe it's just me. Can everyone hear Matthew?
No.
Or does Kennedy want to close the session then?
Okay, I can do that. So thank you so much, Monica, for the very fantastic session, and for everyone for the very interesting conversation, and to the panelists for such insightful contribution. Thank you so much. This has given us a lot of food for thought, but also personal reflections in our journeys as we navigate these different issues that have come up. So being mindful of the time, we are right on time for the end of this session. We have the next session that is scheduled in half an hour. So today is a very packed day. I think it's the most packed day of all the other days in the conference. So please bear with us if you've been attending most of our sessions. Tomorrow we only have two sessions to go. So I'll see you all at 5 p.m. That's half an hour from now for the next session.